And with that, we welcome in Ashley Bastock from the Toledo Blade, the Michigan beat writer. And Ashley, here we are, Big Ten play for the Wolverines. And if you reflect back a year ago, it was that win over Wisconsin, which was kind of the beginning of the revenge tour for the Wolverines. That's kind of really what propelled them on to really great heights up until the last two games of the season. But that Wisconsin game a year ago was a very big turning point for this Wolverine program.
Yeah, and I think going forward on Saturday, they're very excited that it's the first game of Big Ten play, obviously. But there's also the element of the first two games haven't been exactly pretty for Michigan football, especially on the offensive end. The defense has probably played about as well as you would hope your defense would play through the first two games of the season. The only touchdowns they've given up in regulation have been the sudden change ones. So, I think they're ready to kind of move forward and hopefully show all of us what this offense is going to look like and hopefully do it being healthy.
Michigan's 2-0, Wisconsin's 2-0. Neither one has really played anybody that good, although I should say Army I think is going to be a good team. I think Army, perhaps Michigan does have the better victories than Wisconsin. Badgers, though, have put up gaudier numbers than Michigan through the first two games.
Yeah, exactly. And you look at Jonathan Taylor, who's the name I think that everyone knows on this roster. He already has around 250 rushing yards and 5 touchdowns through 2 games. So he's the person that I think this Badger offense is really going to rely on. It's kind of a no-brainer. And on Monday when Jim Harbaugh spoke about the upcoming game, he said that, we don't look at it as trying to stop a guy like that. He's going to get his yards and his scores, but it's all about containing him. So it sounds like that's their strategy. It's probably a pretty reasonable strategy because, again, most of the Badger offense goes through him.
And Wisconsin's even using him a little bit as, not necessarily as a receiver, but they haven't been afraid to get the ball out to him in the flat and use him coming out of the backfield, just another way to get him more involved.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that will be a pretty good challenge for the Michigan defense early, probably the best rushing challenge they will have faced so far this season. So how well that front seven does will be a huge key. And Don Brown last week actually got asked, what do you think of criticism that your interior line is not going to be able to hold up against the Wisconsin run game? And he said it was, quote, a bunch of crap. So that's that on that for Don Brown, I guess, the Wolverines defensive coordinator. And, we'll see come Saturday how well that interior line holds up.
Yeah, Don Brown never pulls punches, and that interior line will be tested. And the secondary for Michigan, that's been their strength defensively. And the stereotype on Wisconsin is you don't have to worry about the receivers, but they always seem to have one or two sneaky guys that if you're not careful will burn you. And I think that's kind of the recipe again this year for the Badgers.
Yeah, I agree. And, I think what benefits Michigan the most coming obviously off the bye week, but having Army be their most recent opponent is that the Wolverine defense and the Wolverine secondary faced similar situations in week 2 in that they're more worried about stopping the run game first and foremost, but the secondary knows they can't fall asleep. And actually, Brad Hawkins talked pretty extensively about that before the Army game. And I think they did a pretty good job. Obviously, Lavert Hill's interception was arguably one of the plays of the game on a rare Army pass. So definitely, I think, was a good tune-up playing the Black Knights first.
Defense had more philosophical questions going into this Wisconsin matchup. I think offense has some more concrete questions. We've talked about these, the short down situation, turnovers, and I know Coach Harbaugh was asked about the turnovers on Monday and gave maybe a classic non-answer answer to that question.
Yeah, exactly. I think I was actually the one that asked him about, if these aren't happening in practice, which is what Coach Gaddis said, how do you stop them? And, he just said it's re-emphasizing it in drills and, really telling the Michigan scout team that they need to work on trying to get the ball out of the offense's hands. So we'll see if it paid off. But, yeah, we don't really know how exactly that looked in the practice. And it's, I imagine, pretty difficult when, as Josh Gaddis said last week, the Wolverines weren't seeing those plays and those mistakes happen in practice.
And football coaches are never exactly forthcoming when it comes to injuries, and certainly Jim Harbaugh towing that line this week. No real updates on Donovan Peoples-Jones, no real updates on Runyon, no real updates on Shea Patterson. We knew Michigan needed that time off to kind of cure and heal up some minor things, so it will be interesting to see what the health of that team is going up to Madison.
Yeah, I agree. And as you said, you pretty much said it all, right? There was no real updates given. Jim Harbaugh said he wasn't sure who was going to be ready on Saturday right now versus who was. Whether or not he knows that and just isn't telling us, that is certainly a possibility. What we do know is after the Army game, when he got asked about John Runyon at left tackle, he He did say that he was, quote, on the verge of being able to come back and that they just decided to play it safe, which is understandable. With the bye week, they didn't want whatever his injury is to become a lingering one. So he could very well suit up, but we didn't get any for sure answers on any of those guys on Monday. And, I also think Donovan Peoples-Jones would be a potentially huge addition to this offense as they try to figure some things out, since he's their most targeted receiver last year.
What's the mood of the team as they're heading for their first road game of the season? It's always one of those things where teams will tell you that first road trip can really set the tone for the entire year. And particularly when you look at the fact that Michigan, believe it or not, has not won in Madison since Lloyd Carr was head coach. Now, granted, they don't go to Madison every other year,
right?
But 2001, last time they had a victory in Madison. Camp Randall, one of the great places to visit, one of the great places to play a college football game. What's their mood going into Wisconsin?
Yeah, well, Jim Harbaugh did talk about that. He's the one that actually brought up that 2001 stat on Monday. So I think they're very much aware of it. They're very much aware that Camp Randall is a difficult place to play, and I think they're maybe ready to turn the corner, like as we've talked about now the last 2 weeks with some of these mistakes on short yardage situations and with some of these mistakes as far as fumbling the ball and turnovers. So, I think they are really ready to just kind of get on with it as far as conference play goes, and hopefully, if they get their way, surprise a lot of people who I think are maybe not expecting this team to hold up after what we saw in the first 2 weeks of the season for them.
And I think one thing to keep an eye on during that game is Ben Bredesen, the offensive lineman, one of the captains of the team. He is from Wisconsin.
Yes.
It's very emotional for him to play against the Badgers. Certainly, his family still lives in Wisconsin, and they've talked about in the past where they don't like losing to Wisconsin because then they hear about it all year long from their neighbors.
Yes, and Ben Bredesen brought that up again on Monday, that, he gets texts every year when Michigan plays Wisconsin, and he said that the texts are pretty plentiful if Michigan loses and that his phone goes quiet if they win. So I assume he is hoping for the sake of his battery that Michigan will win as for the sake of their record too.
All right, thank you very much, Ashley, as the Michigan Wolverines head on the road for their Big Ten opener coming up on Saturday.